Great. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. Today's webinar topic is cybersecurity risk assessments for MACRA and HIPAA compliance. We'll talk specifically about Medicare and some of the new requirements when it comes to Medicare reimbursements and how cybersecurity kind of fits into that. So I'm super excited to be doing this today. It's a pretty interesting topic. We've received a lot of interesting questions over the last several quarters about MACRA and what the implications are from a cybersecurity standpoint. So today we'll be diving into that. The duration of the webinar should be no more than 30 minutes, and we'll leave some room for some questions at the end. And we will be recording this entire session, and we'll be sending it out to everyone, all the registered participants, as well as the attendees. We also are giving away a security risk assessment checklist. So feel free to reach out to me at the end of the webinar. We'd be happy to send that over to you. It's a pretty quick, down and dirty way of doing a risk assessment. If you are doing this yourself, we'll dive into that at the latter half of this presentation. Once again, thank you all for joining me today. Okay, so a little background of myself. So I'm the CEO and co-founder of Entreda. Entreda is a cybersecurity risk mitigation software company. We're based in Silicon Valley. We've been in business about 5 years. And what we do is we work with healthcare firms and financial services firms, and we help them elevate their cybersecurity posture and gain compliance with whatever framework those organizations are compliant to. And we do this in a very unique way. We do this with the help of some software that we've developed. I've spent north of a decade in the Valley working on a variety of different IT initiatives. My most recent company was a company called Plato Networks, where we developed a secure interconnect for data centers. We sold that company to NetLogic. It was eventually acquired for $4 billion by another company called Broadcom. Did a project for the NSA in 2008, where my team developed a new form of crypto acceleration to protect certain assets of national interest. It was a fully NSA-funded program. Did another startup in 2002, which was an early form of software-defined networking. So I've done a couple of different startups, spent a bulk of my time developing tools to solve certain IT problems, and most recently here at Entreda focused on cybersecurity risk mitigation, specifically for HIPAA, SEC, FINRA, GLBA type requirements. All right? Awesome. So this topic is a very interesting one, and it's something that hits home personally to me because we've been trying to educate a lot of our clients on the needs of cybersecurity and the needs of cybersecurity risk assessments. And, a lot of organizations get it, many organizations don't. But with the recent changes in some of the regulations, we're starting to see that cybersecurity risk assessments and security risk assessments in general are being tied to performance incentives and payments and reimbursements, which is a first, because folks are starting to realize that as organizations build their operational efficiency, they have to take into account how they're managing risk, and cybersecurity is a critical element of that risk equation. And so this is a good example of that. So with Medicare reimbursements, any organization that is applying to get reimbursed from a Medicare standpoint now has to demonstrate that they have security risk assessments being done periodically. So it's a pretty big step. It's part of what's known as a merit-based incentive payment system, which means that when firms are applying for reimbursement through MIPS or any of the other quality initiatives, there's actually two, we'll talk about that, they have to demonstrate that they've done a thorough risk assessment. And we'll talk about what entails a risk assessment, because a lot of folks seem to believe that a risk assessment is basically the EHR vendor providing certification that the EHR system is protected, right? Either via a SOC report or some sort of a vulnerability or pen test assessment that the EHR vendor provides. And the answer is that's absolutely not adequate from a security risk assessment standpoint. And we'll talk about that. So what is MACRA, right? So MACRA stands for, literally, Medicare Access and Chip Reauthorization Act, and this was first introduced in 2015. So the philosophy behind MACRA was to essentially streamline a patchwork of programs that existed, and to basically tie payment reimbursement and performance-based payments to reimbursement programs that most organizations apply for, Medicare being one of the largest ones in healthcare. And there are two paths in this program as defined by MACRA. One is a merit-based incentive payment system, and another one is an advanced alternative payment model, APM as they call it. We're going to focus bulk of the presentation today on MIPS, because cybersecurity risk assessments are an integral component of the MIPS program. Okay, so how does the MIPS scoring and weighting system work? Well, first off, the way the MIPS scoring system works is it's based on a number of factors. Quality, improvement activities that an organization takes on, and advancing care information. And they've assigned basically weights to each of these elements, quality being 60%, improvement activities and various types of advancing care type activities accounting for the other 40%. So together it's about 100%, all right? And the goal is that based on scoring, based on MIPS scoring and the weights, organizations are basically provided either an increment or a decrement from a reimbursement standpoint. And so there's a bit of a complex equation. We'll touch upon that here, but a lot of data around this is available on the cms.gov website. I'd be happy to provide you information. We're going to cover some of those topics here. But the advancing care information has a big green dot right on top of it, because that's bulk of where the cybersecurity risk assessment kind of falls into, and we'll talk about that as well. So who does MACRA and MIPS actually affect? Well, any clinical firm or any healthcare organization that's billing more than $30,000 to Medicare Part B a year, which is a pretty low amount from a reimbursement standpoint. So if you're a home health clinic, you're a physician's office, physician's assistant, your group practice that accepts Medicare patients, and you provide care to, let's say, north of 100 Medicare patients, you now are affected or have the ability to apply for reimbursement and have to demonstrate quality as part of your reimbursement application, right? So these are just some examples. Now, how does one participate? Well, so there are several ways, and this is the real cool thing around MIPS, is that you could do a full year, you could do a partial year, and so they don't penalize you from a reimbursement standpoint if you can only demonstrate compliance for let's say partial of the year as opposed to the full year, right? But the reimbursement equation and the MIPS scoring equation does change depending on the amount of data that you actually are able to provide. So that's a pretty critical component. Being able to demonstrate continuous, let's say security risk assessments for the purposes of this webinar positively benefits the organization, because you're able to basically maximize your scoring when it comes to MIPS scoring, and we'll talk about that. So, the 2017 was the first performance year, and it started basically on January 1st, all the way to December 31st. So organizations had the ability to be able to develop data for the entire year to demonstrate their preparedness when it came to cybersecurity risk assessments. And March 31st of 2018 is a pretty critical date because that's the date by which data needs to be submitted in order to not have any negative consequences from a reimbursement standpoint, and actually have a positive benefit if you actually have the data, right? And then there's a period of time where you're able to get some feedback, and then reapply for any payment adjustments at the end of the year, essentially by January of 2019. So pretty crucial year. We're in this 27 through 2019 period where firms have the ability to demonstrate that they are in compliance. Specifically, healthcare organizations are in compliance with the MACRA rules. Okay, so security risk analysis, or commonly known as the SRA, is a required component from a base score standpoint. So if you look at the advancing care information, and if I backtrack my slides, notice that 25% of the score was attributed to advancing care information. So if you break that down, security risk analysis is an integral part, but most importantly, it's a required measure as part of the base score. And so the way the scoring is actually calculated is that in order to account for 25% of the final score, there's a base score and then there's a performance score and a bonus score based on a variety of different factors. It all begins with the base score. So if you don't have a security risk analysis, your base score ends up being 0, which, so it's pretty binary from a risk analysis standpoint. And once again, when we look at a security risk analysis, assuming that your EHR vendor is doing the security risk analysis is not enough. You have to have the ability to do a security risk analysis focused on the infrastructure that houses the EHR system. So that's devices, that's networks, that's users being employees, as well as contractors, right? So it's way broader than just looking at any one application or the other. Now, if you look further, 50% of the total score that's allocated is based on the advancing care information, okay? 50% being the base score, 90% being the performance score, 15% being the bonus score. So when we look at base score plus performance score plus bonus score, they're not all weighted equally. 50% is based on the base score, right? And so in order to earn the full 25 points, or 25%, which is allocated to the advancing care information component, or the bucket, 50% of that is based on the base score, which again is tied binarily to the security risk analysis, right? Critical component. Okay, so how do you do a security risk assessment? How does that even done, right? So we're going to spend the next 10 to 15 minutes just talking about security risk assessments. So when you look at a security risk assessment per HIPAA guidelines, HIPAA talks about essentially 5 different steps that are kind of broken up. Those basically include administrative safeguards that an organization has to be able to demonstrate, physical safeguards, technical safeguards, having organizational standards, and obviously documenting all the policies and procedures to that effect. Now, when we start to dive into each of these items, administrative safeguards basically entail making sure that, number one, there is a chief information security officer designated within the organization, someone that is responsible from a cybersecurity standpoint. And typically, it's a good practice to designate someone as a CISO other than the individual that's actually responsible for IT within the organization, because that function is sort of checks and balances, right? It's sort of the equivalent of saying, if I'm the CFO of an organization and I were to certify that the financial numbers of my organization are accurate, well, of course, you're going to say that because you are the CFO of the organization. It's always a good idea to have a third-party independent auditor come in and say, well, we reviewed the financials and everything that the CFO is saying is accurate. So checks and balances is something that's important. So it's always a good idea to designate a third-party CISO within an organization. And that could be a dedicated person other than the chief information security, other than the CIO or the IT person, or it could be a third-party firm that you hire or a fractional CISO, right? Good idea to do that. And having sort of periodic risk assessments as part of your administrative safeguard is super important, making sure that the workforce is trained on the privacy and the security rules. Now, within physical safeguards, physical security is a key component. Having a facility, if you have a data center where you're housing a server, making sure that it's in a locked up closet so nobody's walking away with the server, making sure that the computer equipment is not easily stolen. If you have laptops, having measures in place to make sure that you can basically protect those assets. Portable devices need to have a Find My iPhone type capability or GPS system enabled. Things like that. Having physical security safeguards is a quintessential important item. I can't stress how many times, if you look at the last year, 2017, probably the most common breach incident was laptops that were unencrypted being stolen from cars, right? Pretty common issue. That would be part of the whole physical safeguard component. Technical safeguard would be getting into the nitty-gritty, right? Looking at audit logs, having network security measures in place, making sure that you've got individuals that are checking administrative privileges on all mission-critical systems, including EHR systems, right? Making sure that contingency plans are in place, so having an adequate business continuity plan. Testing incident responses, so having mock drills where you create an incident and test what the response systems are, sort of like an earthquake or a fire drill within an organization, but from a cybersecurity standpoint. Doing that continuously is an important consideration. So doing that and doing that periodically and having documented evidence that the firm does in fact have an incident response plan in place is part of the whole technical safeguard component. Organizational standards, vetting all the vendors that an organization does business with. So third-party vendor risk assessments, super important. Having a documented protocol for what happens post-breach. Do you have a forensics team? Is there a breach response team, kind of like a CSI team that comes on board the minute that an incident is detected within an organization? Super important component. Again, not just saying that the firm has it, but actually testing it is super important. And then policies and procedures, right? Having policies that actually meet HIPAA guidelines. One of the items that we stress very heavily when it comes to policies and procedures is that it's an important item to make sure that the policy meets a industry standard framework, such as high trust or NIST, and making sure that the written policy, in some way maps to those frameworks. And then once you actually have policies in place, making sure that you've actually got audit trail to demonstrate that the policy is in effect. Because there's no point having a policy with no demonstrable evidence to show that the organization is following it. So those are the two components that are super important, making sure that the entire organization is trained on the policy. So these are the 5 items that kind of give you an idea of what a security risk assessment is all about, but making sure that when you're filing those reimbursement applications and you're reporting to the CMS from a quality standpoint, that all these elements, administrative safeguards, physical safeguards, technical, organizational standards, policies and procedures, all of these items are reviewed. The Chief Information Security Officer provides attestation to the fact that all these 5 elements are fixed, and you're able to basically submit that as part of your application, right? So our recommendation in this is to always ensure that you've got a third-party firm that's doing it, because the organization is more than likely to provide attestation that these things are in fact there, but it holds more value when you have an independent third party that doesn't necessarily need to sign off on that to come in and actually check it and sign off on it. We think that has greater value, both from an organizational standpoint as well as from a reporting standpoint. And, it's a good idea to repeat this, because if you do it once in 18 months or once in 3 years, as was recommended by HIPAA, sure, you'd be meeting the basic rules, but this is a journey, not a destination. Having a process that's continuous actually adds value to the organization rather than just being a compliance checkbox. And so that's our view and our philosophy. So let's dive a little bit deeper into sort of the NIST framework, which we believe is a good way of kind of mapping the organizational controls to an industry standard framework. You could certainly use HITRUST. We like NIST because we think it's actually quite simple to follow, and many of the commonly known services map quite nicely to the 5-step process that NIST talks about. And actually, HIPAA and NIST have a very simple mapping framework. In fact, if you go again on the CMS website, you'll see a crosswalk between the NIST SP 800 framework and HIPAA guidelines, HIPAA privacy and HIPAA security guidelines. And so those two map real nice together. And so we always like to use an industry standard framework that kind of maps well to this. So when you look at the 5 steps, which are identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. Those are the 5 steps under NIST. Many of the services that we've listed here kind of map to that. So under identify, you've got things like inventorying your assets. So knowing all the devices that you actually have, servers, mobile devices, laptops, desktops. Having a way to basically document real-time threat notifications, being able to do policies, cybersecurity policies, having review processes in place, doing security scanning and pen testing, and doing third-party vendor vetting, right? These are all part of the identify process. When it comes to detection, that would be more detailed stuff like doing HIDS, which is host-based intrusion detection, or network-based intrusion detection. So doing packet captures to see if the networks are safe, if the servers are safe, are they exhibiting any malicious behavior? Are you auditing administrative privileges to server assets? So non-user endpoints, right? Application servers, file servers, those kinds of things. And then when you get into protection, it would be doing security awareness training for the entire organization, doing simulated social engineering exercises in the form of phishing, doing compliance reporting, remediating things in real time, ensuring that you've got email or secure messaging in place. In fact, MACRA specifically calls out secure messaging as one item as part of their quality measure. So that's another very important item. So not only securing data at rest, but also data in motion, right? Device encryption, portable media encryption, making sure that all critical systems that have been identified have multi-factor authentication of some sort, either dual factor, ideally more than dual factor, making sure you've got monitoring of data from a leakage standpoint, whether it's USB drives or any sort of cloud drives, having secure network access via VPNs, documenting remote data accesses into devices, logging every session, right? So those kinds of things. Those would all kind of fall into the protection phase. And then respond, recover would be ensuring that you've actually got a call center in place to respond to issues, having proactive support for the organization, having incident response, doing business continuity, recovery drills, all that would entail, that would be part and parcel of the respond and recover phase, right? So this is kind of a good way of kind of breaking things up. Now, I'm going to spend the next 2 slides to kind of give you some food for thought, right? So today, one of the biggest challenges that we see in the industry is in order to implement a NIST-type framework, you can certainly do that, right? I mean, there's about probably 25 different software packages, a bunch of service delivery components, and then layering, governance, risk, and compliance methodologies. You could put together a package to implement a NIST framework. The challenge you run into is cross integration between a number of these point solutions, right? Each of these point solutions, whether it's an antivirus system or a patch management system or a security awareness training system or a vendor due diligence system or making sure you've got log analysis through a SIEM, or having mobile device management tools or VPN. These are all siloed products. And so organizations are struggling to kind of put all these things together and kind of have a common reporting interface that someone can quickly audit, make sure that everyone's on the same page, and when things are not going right, things rise up to the top, right? And so we see this sort of siloed manual workflow-based model being a thing of the past. So what we've done at Entreda and our whole mission, and even if you're not using our tools, by the way, is to try to build, a system that can essentially cross-integrate between all these different services, and makes the life of an organization, a CISO or chief compliance officer or anybody that's managing risk, kind of having a risk dashboard, right? A heat map that kind of gives you a sense of how the organization is doing is something that we see as being a very important new initiative. In the age of dashboards and visualization of risk, right? Cybersecurity should be no different. You should have a way to be able to visualize risk at the highest level. And so that's building automation, building integration, having a data-driven process, moving away from a workflow system we think is best practice, right? So in our world, just to kind of give you sort of one embodiment of how this might get implemented in practice, what we've done at Entreda is built a system, call it an automation system, that allows us to kind of get a sense of how an organization is doing from a risk management standpoint, but not just doing it as a point in time, but doing it continuously. So we try to practice what we preach. And the way we do that is by implanting a sensor on the network, on the devices that the organization uses, which then essentially gathers a whole bunch of metadata about the posture of the device, the network, the user, and then we present a dashboard, a heat map, with some smart remediations built right into the tool, but most importantly, being able to generate automated reports that demonstrate independent third-party compliance. And so our whole vision is to not replace the IT organization or the IT framework of an organization, but to provide checks and balances, and being able to do that in an automated way takes away a lot of the manual and workflow-based models that organizations have. And it also helps us kind of price it at a level that can be easily adopted by organizations, right? So that's our whole view. So that kind of gives you a sense of why security risk assessments, in a nutshell, are a very critical ingredient for healthcare organizations that are applying for Medicare reimbursement. In fact, 25% of your reimbursement fee could be withheld if you do not do security risk assessments in time, right? So that's a key issue. So I wanted to, at this point, just kind of jump off from this topic and move into and share some data that we've collected over the course of time. But before I sort of jump straight into that, I thought I'd take some questions that folks have. Okay, so we're going to hit a few sort of high-level questions. I think we have time for maybe 3 questions. So question number 1, security risk assessments. What are some of the simple sub-steps that an organization has to follow in order to implement a security risk assessment per HIPAA guidelines, right? So number 1, security risk assessments are being done today by a number of third-party organizations, right? So you could hire security consultants HIPAA consultants that can basically kind of walk you through a checklist of items per the CMS guidance, and that's great, right? So that's certainly a good way to do that. And when you look at the checklist, those basically entail the 5 things that I talked about, right? Having administrative safeguards, having physical safeguards, having technical safeguards, making sure that the organization has administrative policies that reflect everything, and last but not the least, making sure the policy and procedures are documented, right? So, if you can do those 5 things well and have an organization help you do that, those are the 5 core steps that organizations need to follow, and each of them has sub-steps, right? I could send you a simple worksheet that helps organizations kind of work through, and you can certainly get that from any security consulting firm. So what we've tried to do at Entreda, though, is we're not a typical security consulting firm, so we don't actually replace what a security consultant firm does. We build tools that aid security consultants or an internal organization do their own security risk assessments in a simplified way, in a data-driven way, and be able to repeat it continuously, because we don't think that a security risk assessment is a point-in-time activity. It needs to be continuous. And it should not break the bank for an organization. It should be in a model that it kind of just gets baked into the IT workflow and IT fabric of an organization. So that's our view. So embodying the administrative, physical, technical, and some of the other sub-steps, but building some automation is what we focus on. Okay, question number 2. What are some of the common frameworks that organizations could use when it comes to a cybersecurity framework? High trust or HIPAA. So the good news here is that there are a number of frameworks an organization could use. You could use an ISO 27001. You could use high trust. You could use NIST. There's really philosophies, and different organizations might use a different framework for a variety of reasons. The good news is, from a HIPAA standpoint or a CMS standpoint, any framework will do as long as you stick to it, and you've got documented evidence that you're following it. So there isn't any one standard. Now, having said that, we at Entreda like the NIST cybersecurity framework because we think it's it can be easily mapped and can be automated in a way that makes it easier for organizations to repeat it. And so that's the framework we've chosen. But an organization can certainly choose any of those. Any of those would work just as well. And then, last but not the least, how do we at Entreda help organizations with doing cybersecurity risk assessments? Okay, so this is a point that I brought up earlier. What we do here at Entreda is that we don't replace an internal IT organization. We do not replace a security consulting firm. What we do is we build tools that help these organizations perform these tasks in a much more efficient way, right? So we're a software company at the core. We do help, kind of set up our system so that it makes it implementable for an organization. We recognize that cybersecurity is a very fragmented industry, and there's just so many different point solutions. And in order to implement a governance framework at any reasonable scale, you need all the core elements, and they all have to work well together. And so what we've done here at Entreda is kind of build a software system ground up that cross-integrates between all these different silos with a common reporting interface and a risk dashboard that provides kind of a holistic view, a 360-degree view of a cybersecurity risk graph of an organization. So that's what we do. And so we, again, complement what IT organizations do, both internal and external, as well as security consultants. All right. So that brings us to the end of this webinar. I really appreciate you guys joining us today. Once again, if you guys need that security checklist, I'd be happy to send it to you. Feel free to drop me an email. You can reach me at sid at Entreda.com. My contact info is right here. So feel free to ping me at the end of this. We will be sending it out anyhow to all the registered participants, as well as a copy of this recording to all the folks. We wish you all the luck. Be safe. And until next time, take care.